Okay, so this is the ethics portion of the lecture, and this is not a complete course on ethics. That we do have an undergraduate course on information ethics and the sorts of things that you would need to know broadly as an information technology professional. The one thing I do want to differentiate here in this particular chapter that is mostly on legal issues is that in the law you will have formal written documents that are going to be interpreted by a court system to which you will be held accountable, your customers will be held accountable, citizens are going to be held accountable. And those are not always true with ethics. And the conflicts between the two are very, very important from the standpoint of understanding what your role as an information technology specialist is. In particular, you have to be responsible for the ethics, the enforcement, the definitions, the understanding. You have to make sure that they're not arbitrated unfairly or understood improperly by people in your own organization, especially for information security issues. So there are very important differences in terms of your responsibility. The ACM has, in their code of ethics for computing professionals, which would include anyone working in information security, a claim that if you understand the law well enough to know what the morally, ethically correct thing to do is, then you have met your ethical responsibility, right? You may actually be in a position where violating a law is the ethically correct thing to do because the law as written is unjust. And this is literally part of the ACM's code of ethics for information security professionals. Information technology professionals, really. So it's very important to know the difference between the two and to recognize that even if the law says you must do something, the ethical code that you are bound to as a software engineer, information technology professional, information security professional may differentiate, may require you to do something different, to take steps possibly in contravention of the law. Okay, so what can we do to examine a situation for ethical issues? First, you have to understand all of the domain around that situation. It's entirely possible in some of the areas that we'll work in information security to not have very much of an understanding about the broader context of what's going on, especially for complicated financial companies or complicated healthcare scenarios. You may not know the domain well enough to be a domain expert, but you still have to understand the situation well enough to identify and highlight ethical issues, one of which would be not having enough domain information to be comfortable making a decision about information security issues. You should know several different theories of ethical reasoning. Maybe the most introductory of those would be utilitarianism, which is essentially the notion that we're all trying to seek the best possible good for the largest group of people. That is one way of doing ethical reasoning. There are problems with that. And it's the kind of thing that is taught in the information ethics class that you as an undergrad should be taking. You should be able to then list several possible ethical principles that would be involved in making a decision in the situation that you're currently in. And I think actually coming up with the list, physically writing it down, can be very helpful if you're looking at a somewhat complicated scenario. I like doing this with some of the ones that are reported in the media, the Aaron Schwartz case being a good example. What would have been the best way for him to go about getting access to JSTOR records if you're wanting to make a political point? And then on the other side, what are the ethics involved in the prosecutor's decision to continue to pursue such serious consequences after the plea bargain has been denied? Very important to think about all of those principles and to list out some of the options involved and examine them from an ethical standpoint. Then you want to figure out which principle is going to outweigh the others, the one that you want to use as your choice. And then you make and defend from an ethical standpoint the choice to act or not act in that particular scenario. This is the high-level basics of ethical reasoning, the kinds of things that you should be learning in the ethics class here at UMBC. All right, basic ethical theories. The textbook goes into a number of other options, but I really like this one because it's really not a terrible one-slide summary of thousands of years of thought in ethics. Essentially, you have two different rules that you can look at, either an individual application or a universal application. And then you can look at a consequence-based theory or a rule-based theory. So if you're looking in particular at an individual oriented assessment of consequence-based reasoning, then your ethical defense would be based entirely on the consequences that might happen to a particular individual, right? So going to the Aaron Swartz case, the prosecutor might be saying, well, in theory, if I were doing a universal rule-oriented approach, I would want to make sure that these rules are enforced so that they would deter future violations of this sort. But based on the particular individual involved and the particular circumstances of this actual act, maybe I'm not going to be as harsh as I could be, right? That's the prosecutorial discretion arguing that maybe we should not have put $1 million in fines and 35 years in prison on the table with Aaron Swartz. Or you could take the opposite approach. You could take the universal rule-based approach and say, well, these are rules that were well known in advance and they do evidently apply to everyone. So making sure that they're applied evenly and fairly is an important principle on its own, and that's the reason why we would want to enforce them the way that we have. Now, I think you can do this even if you are not an expert in ethics. The outline in the chapter is relatively good. And frankly, I think you should be able to see this, and for those of you who've taken 301, the ethics class, and some of the examples that are in the ethics class, it's a pretty effective way of coming up with an initial ethical analysis of different situations. Even not knowing all of the particulars of the situation, you should still be able to break it down at the very least using this individual versus universal and consequence versus rule-based approach. All right, well, this is a very quick summary of everything that we've talked about. Copyrights, patents, and trade secrets really are critical for protecting both software systems themselves, but also as an information security professional, they're critical to your role in understanding the organizational assets that you're trying to protect. There may be legal intricacies that determine your actions and how you should interact with vendors and employees. And depending on what organization you're working for and what domain they work in, they may be unique to your particular situation. So it's the kind of thing that you're not going to just be able to learn once and then forget. You have to study this regardless of which organization you end up at in the moment, in the domain that you end up working in. And of course, there are many different statutes that apply. Some of them are overlapping, both in terms of jurisdiction and in terms of domain. You're going to want to contact lawyers. Information security professionals work very, very closely with lawyers whenever there is an incident, or when you're planning policy. It's important to know what the law is so that you're not putting yourself behind the eight ball unintentionally. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, you still have an obligation to examine this on your own personal ethical code, your own moral code. And that may mean conflicting with things that have been outlined as company policy or things that have been outlined as literal law of the realm. And you may be obligated to violate those depending upon whether or not that law is fair or outdated or what have you. So it's worth being conversant in those issues.